Hey, Psychology 111 class, how are you doing? This is Professor Thurtle, and I'm making this video because I wanted to respond to some of the great discussions that I saw happening on the discussion boards for chapters 1 and 2, and also comment on a couple of the links that you guys had provided for chapter 3 as well. And also try and clarify some of the things that or questions that you had or themes that came up in the discussion boards. So one of the themes I noticed coming up was the discussion about vaccines and autism, because that's kind of like still around in society that there might be some links between vaccination and autism. So let me start out by saying it is as conclusive as we can get that there is no link between vaccines and autism. So to kind of back up what I just said, I need to give you a little bit of history. You probably read a little bit about it in the textbook. So there was a study done back in 1998 by a doctor called Andrew Wakefield. The study was called Allele Lymphoid Nodular Hyperplasia, Nonspecific Colitis, and Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children. And as part of that study, it was claimed that there seemed to be a correlation between children who had received the MMR vaccine and symptoms appearing from autism. So that was published in 1998, and at that time it caused a lot of controversy, a lot of discussion, a lot of concern about the safety of vaccinations. We had this diagnosis of autism. We didn't really know what caused it. It started occurring at age 2, around the time that children were receiving these vaccinations. And so as we are pattern-seeking humans, our brains like to look for cause and effect, that, vaccines seem to be implicated in that. And so if you were conducting some research, how might you go about seeing if this was the case? Well, you might start out and go, okay, if I was conducting an experiment and I didn't care about ethics, I could go and find 1 million children and do an experimental method where I put 500,000 in the control group, 500,000 in an experimental group. The control group got no vaccinations whatsoever. And in the experimental group, I'd give them all the vaccinations they were supposed to receive. And then we would just see how those children developed over time. Now, obviously, that's massively unethical. We also wouldn't be able to control an experiment of that size. So the best way to try and figure out if there was any truth to this would be to have a look at health outcomes in children. Have a look at the health outcomes for vaccinated children who are vaccinated on the schedule versus children who did not receive the vaccinations. Maybe also have a look at a subgroup of children whose siblings were autistic. Maybe we also want to question, well, maybe vaccinations aren't bad for all children, but maybe there's a subgroup that is predisposed to autism, so maybe the vaccinations trigger something. Okay, so let me start out by saying that those studies have been done. And that the original piece of research that Andrew Wakefield conducted was only done on 12 children. So that's kind of like the first red flag there. That's not very many children. Since 1998, there was more red flags thrown up by that initial piece of research. It was eventually discovered that there were many problems with that initial piece of research, that he'd not disclosed he was being paid by lawyers of parents of children who had believed that the MMR had caused a reaction in their children. So he was going into the research being paid to find some kind of link. He was not honest about how the patients were recruited. His study was not approved by an ethics committee. He was dishonest about how he collected the blood samples, and he showed callous disregard for the distress and pain of the children involved. He carried out medical interventions without the correct pediatric qualifications to do so, and the tests he conducted were not indicated by their symptoms or their diagnoses. It was later discovered that he'd also faked some of the data in that original study as well. And so in 2010, the General Medical Council, which is basically the body in England which looks at things like this, reviewed the case, found all of these things, and struck him off the medical registrar. In other words, Andrew Wakefield lost his license to practice medicine. Also, the journal where the original study was published, The Lancet, retracted the paper completely in 2010. When a journal retracts a paper, it's basically saying the contents of this paper were not true, they were inaccurate, they had a big problem with the research in one way or another. Sometimes authors retract their own papers because, you know, they submit it and someone doesn't catch an error and it's published, and the authors find out afterwards and they're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, we need to retract this. I discovered an error somewhere in my, you know, in my research, or I discovered another problem, it should be retracted. It's not as, and that's fairly rare. What's even more rare is when a journal itself decides to retract a paper. So, and the editor of The Lancet said that the paper they retracted was utterly false, and The Lancet had been deceived by Andrew Wakefield. So I'm hoping this paints a picture of just how unethical and bad this piece of research that started the whole vaccination autism supposed link, just how bad it was. But you'll notice I'm saying all these things happened in 2010, which meant the process to uncover this, identify it, and be able to follow up, test, and discover all these things took about 12 years. And so the damage was really kind of done by that point. So hopefully that gives you an example of how bad the original research was. And there have been many studies since then that have found no link whatsoever between the MMR vaccine and autism. Other vaccinations have also been looked at and have not found any link between vaccinations and autism. And there is the latest one was in just last year, in 2019, a study from Denmark looked at over 500,000 children. They looked at about 650,000 children in Denmark, and basically looked at, okay, look at, of all these children, over 500,000 children, look at the ones who are vaccinated, look at the ones who are unvaccinated, and then be able to follow their medical records. I believe they started looking at children in 1999, and followed those children up through into their teenage years. And there was no difference between the unvaccinated group and the vaccinated group when it came to incidence of autism. There was the same percentage of autism in both groups. And interestingly enough, this study also did look at children whose siblings had been diagnosed with autism, because you'd think, okay, you know, maybe these children are going to be more likely to have something triggered by a vaccine if a vaccine can trigger autism in some form or fashion. And again, comparing those groups, there was no difference between the vaccinated and unvaccinated groups. So that's about as robust a study as can be undertaken, and there was no link, no difference found between the vaccinated and unvaccinated groups when it came to autism. There have, now you might also, I think I saw it mentioned on the board that some people talked about vaccine schedules, that the number of vaccines that infants received has increased over the years. And that is true. However, the number of antigens that a infant is exposed to through the vaccination process has gone down. So when we're talking about antigens, we're really talking about any toxin or foreign substance that makes our immune system produce antibodies. Back in the 1980s, that was a lot higher. The vaccines they did receive had a lot more antigens in them than they do today. Some other people had mentioned that vaccines, well, they contained a substance called thimerosal, which is a mercury-related substance, and maybe that was something that was causing autism. Well, back in the early 2000s, thimerosal was removed from the vaccinations. And so, again, if you'd expect that substance to be causing autism, when we removed it from the vaccines, you'd expect to see autism go down. Instead, autism has continued to steadily increase over the years. So, and now I believe the latest research is looking at environmental pollution during gestation as being a possible cause of autism. So, oh yes, sorry, I meant to go back to the schedules. There has been research done into looking at children who are vaccinated on schedule versus a delayed schedule. And there has been found to be no difference in the medical outcomes or the neurological outcomes of children who were delayed on schedule or followed some kind of delayed schedule. So, sorry, I'm looking at my other screen here because I wrote down some stuff. Where is it? Oh, there it is. There was a neurological study done on 1,047 children. And the study was called On-Time Vaccine Receipt in the First Year Does Not Adversely Affect Neuropsychological Outcomes. That was by Smith and Woods in 2010. And so again, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that shows that a delayed versus on-time schedule is better in terms of either health outcomes or psychological outcomes for children. So whenever you're looking at something controversial, the question is, well, how do you figure out how do you decide what's best for you or your children, or what's the right approach? And something I saw come up on the boards was you have to tell people to do their research. That can be tricky without individuals knowing what is where to search and what is a good source or a poor source of information. Because oftentimes when you say, well, go and do your research, the first port of call is the internet, and the internet can have excellent resources on it. It can also have extremely poor or utterly false, utterly incorrect lies on the internet as well. So how do you determine what is good or bad? And so my recommendation is to look at studies done in scientific journals. That way, you know that they're done by experts in the field, they've been reviewed by experts in the field, and that study is being read by experts in the field. Now, when a piece of research is published, that doesn't mean it's the end of the argument, but depending on how strong a piece of research is, it adds more evidence, or, for a certain perspective. So, for example, initially Wakefield published his research. So it was published. It was in a journal for 12 years. So, but that doesn't mean that was the end of the discussion. That was kind of like the beginning of the discussion. Some red flags, even right at the beginning, are only 12 children. That means it's fairly, even if it was completely true, that's fairly weak in terms of evidence. It's a small sample size. Whereas when we look at the Denmark study, and I'm sorry, I didn't mention that before. The title of the study is Measles, Mumps, Rubella Vaccination and Autism. And the authors, one of them I'm not sure how to pronounce, which is HVIID, Havid, I'm not sure, Hansen and Frisch and Melby from 2019. So, looking at over 500,000 children, that's pretty robust, strong evidence. Now, if someone still had a criticism or said, well, maybe you should look at, maybe you should also look at this, then okay, go out and do that research, look for it, go through the same process, go through that kind of like base level standard of writing the research, having it published by a journal, and having other scientists look at it. Always be suspicious if a scientist claims that he is being censored, that he or she cannot get their research published, because then they're really saying that my research cannot even hit like the base level standard of what is required to be published and reviewed. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about vaccinations. Basically, the takeaway I want you to take away from this is, number one, there is, as as well as we can tell, doing as large a study as we can do, has shown no link between vaccines and autism. Now, that doesn't mean that on rare occasions children cannot have reactions to vaccines. That still absolutely occurs, very rarely, but it does occur. So, but the chances of a very serious reaction to a vaccine, and by serious I mean something like seizures or something like that, can be, depending on the vaccine, be like, around 1 in 100,000, let's say. There have been no reported deaths that have been caused by receiving a vaccination. The chances of having a serious reaction to one of the childhood diseases the vaccinations prevent, if a vaccination becomes prevalent in the population, the chances of a child dying from measles are a lot lower. They're about 1 in 10,000. So yes, some, the diseases that we vaccinate for are extremely rare when you have herd immunity, when you have enough people, which is normally between 90 and 95% of the population vaccinating. And so if you decide, okay, around me, over 95% of people are vaccinating their children, then you could probably get away with not vaccinating your child, and that child being perfectly fine and never being exposed to the disease. However, if a large enough amount of people in the community think that way, you can reduce the herd immunity in society and reduce it to a level. Once vaccinations fall below about 90%, it can be a lot easier for a disease to spread throughout a community. And then your unvaccinated child could be exposed to some of these diseases, and then the percentage of them falling ill is a lot higher. than it would be of having any kind of reaction from the vaccine itself. And also, I think another thing to think about when it comes to vaccines is also that for some people, the vaccines do not work. Because another thing I tend to hear is, well, if your child is vaccinated, why, if your child is vaccinated, why are you worried? And the reason is, for some people, the vaccination doesn't produce enough of an immune response for them to receive full protection from the disease. And there are also other people in the community who cannot, for medical reasons, get any kind of vaccination. So by vaccinating yourself, your child, you are creating this kind of protective barrier of herd immunity to protect the vulnerable people in society. It's kind of like the mask thing. With COVID-19 today, is that we are not wearing masks to protect ourselves. COVID is smaller than an oxygen molecule. So I'm sorry, COVID is slightly bigger than an oxygen molecule, but it can still get through most masks unless it's one of those N95 masks. It can get through. It can get through cloth masks. So why are we, if that's the case, why are we all wearing masks? Well, the reason is we're stopping, if we're infected, we're stopping the virus being transmitted by us out to others in the community. So we're wearing the masks to protect other people. Okay, sorry, it was kind of like a lengthy discussion on vaccines, but I will also want to cover some other things that came up. Let's see. Oh, yes. So yeah, just finishing off, do research. I would say yes, but you have to know which research to look at. Don't look at individual claims from people on the internet or on websites. Anyone can make a claim. Anyone who's holding a PhD can say they're a doctor, even though they may not be a doctor of immunology. They might be a doctor of history or a doctor of mathematics or a doctor of physics. So look for peer-reviewed scientific research and look at the strength of that research and then make a decision. And if you don't think that you know enough or think that it's going to be too difficult or too hard to find, then look at if you cannot do the research yourself, look at what collections of experts are saying. So the American Pediatrics Association, for example, would be a good place to start. See if they have a statement on vaccinations, and guess what? They do. And guess what? They recommend them. So that's why sometimes saying to someone, well, just do your research before you make a decision, I think there has to be a little bit more than that. Let's see. A lot of you commented on the ethics of the surprising lack of ethics of all their experiments. And yes, you're absolutely right. That's why we have ethical standards, review, institutional review boards in place to stop someone from conducting research where what they were doing was unethical or not necessary, or just more deceptive or more intrusive than was warranted by what they were trying to find out. So yes, there are reasons why these institutional review boards are in place. And as with Andrew Wakefield, what he did was unethical because he didn't get approval from his ethics board. Yes, some of you also commented on how poorly treated some of the African Americans were, or uninformed, or uninformed in terms of what research they were participating in, or lied to about what they were participating in. So yes, all horrible ethical violations. That is why it is important and why it's explained that we have these standards today to make sure that that does not happen again and to punish people who do try to do that. Let's see. Some people questioned why we are still using certain programs in school, like the DARE program or same-sex education, if science has evaluated it and it was not effective. So yeah, that is a good question to ask. If science always likes to circle back and assess what has been done, look at the outcomes and see if it's still working, whatever it is that's still working. So both the DARE program and same-sex education have not found to be very effective. So think about it, think about why we're choosing to ignore the science. And the most likely answer is going to be kind of why in some cases, certain, certain individuals are ignoring the recommendations of science when it comes to protecting society from COVID-19. It's politics overruling science. That's the bottom line. It's sad to say, but we are, when people stand to gain more through a political decision than a scientific one, unfortunately, sometimes people go with the scientific, the political decision rather than the scientific one. Independent versus dependent variables, just to clear up some confusion between this. When you're doing an experiment, when using the experimental method, let's say I wanted to see if caffeine improved short-term memory. So I wanted to see if I give someone caffeine, can they memorize a list of words better? So if I have 100 people, I might split them into two groups. So one group has to memorize the words and they don't get any caffeine. The other group has to memorize the same words, but they get some caffeine beforehand. And then afterwards, I'm measuring how many words they get on the memory recall test. Okay, so each group gets a list of words. One group gets no caffeine, the other one gets some caffeine. They then try and remember as many words as they can. Then they do the memory test and write down as many words as they can remember. And then I look at the scores from each group and see which group performed better. So in this experiment, the thing I'm changing between the two groups, the thing I'm manipulating between the two groups is the independent variable. So in this case, one group is getting 0 caffeine and the other group is getting some caffeine. So the caffeine in this experiment is the independent variable. That's the thing the experimenter is changing between the two groups. And the dependent variable is what I'm measuring at the end. So in this case, what I'm measuring is the word scores, or the memory test scores from both groups. So that is the dependent variable, the memory test score. What I'm measuring at the end across both groups, that's the dependent variable. So whenever you're looking at an experiment, the way to remember it is, okay, what are the experimenters changing between the two groups? And then at the end, the dependent variable, what is the experimenter measuring between the two groups? Let's see. Some of you mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it starts off, and we'll talk about this in some later chapters, but it was basically having Maslow believed that all of us are striving towards kind of like the top of a pyramid. You'll see Maslow's hierarchy is kind of shaped like a pyramid. At the top is self-actualization. It's like becoming all that you can be, finding the role you want in your life, doing what you want to do in your life. That's kind of like the ultimate goal of being a human. But before we can address that, we have to address other needs. So at the bottom of the pyramid, you have things like physiological needs, like food, water, and shelter. So he believed that you have to take care of those before you go up to the next step and the next step on the pyramid. That we have to take care of more baser or basic needs before we can start finding, before we can take care of, higher ranked needs with the ultimate goal of becoming fully, self-actualized, for, finding fulfillment in our life. Let's see, what other things? A lot of you picked Crash Course as your video links, which is great. I love Crash Course. Fully recommended. It's fun. It's funny. It's informative. But a lot of you found several different sources of links, which were all great. I have to say, you guys found some very interesting links. Some of you found interest in the placebo effect. Placebo effect is fascinating. The idea that giving a person any kind of intervention can make that person's feelings or symptoms feel better, as long as they're subjective. So so giving someone any kind of intervention, even if it is completely inert. So I'm talking things like sugar pill, giving someone a sugar pill for a headache, giving sugar pill for some kind of pain. Anything like that can have an effect on how we subjectively feel. So it could be, an intervention might be getting a paintbrush and slowly caressing someone with a paintbrush. Well, that might, because that's an intervention, it can make people feel subjectively better. Getting a crystal and putting it in someone's head, that's an intervention, so it could make people feel better. As long as the person receiving the treatment thinks that it is some kind of intervention, it can make someone subjectively better. So that can be used, as one person said on the discussion boards, that that could be used to kind of like quote unquote trick people into feeling better or calming down or lowering their blood pressure. So it has a lot of positive uses. However, I would say, as far as the placebo effect, beware of the scams. Be aware of the alternative medicines which make claims about things. That's why often you'll see the double-blind experiments, because the placebo effect, as long as it's some kind of subjective feeling in the body, the placebo effect is quite powerful and can work for any kind of intervention, even in an intervention that doesn't quote unquote work. So some scam artists, some fraudsters will take advantage of that. Some people mentioned Clive Waring, very interesting case. I just want to mention that we'll touch upon that, when we go looking at memory in the later chapters. Naturalistic observation. Someone asked, how is it done on people? How are we able to conduct accurate naturalistic observation? And I'm sure you've all had the experience that if you're driving in your car and you have a cop car behind you, even if you're driving perfectly, being aware there's a cop car behind you changes how you drive. So that's an example of where, once we're aware that we're being watched, our behavior changes. So a true naturalistic observation has to be done in a way that people do not know they're being observed. So that might be having the experimenters in a location where they cannot be seen or heard by the people being observed. And that can be done in a variety of ways. Or it can be done in a way that there might be experimenters there, but they seem to be recording something else which isn't behavior. So, there's a couple of different ways that can happen. Let's see. There was an interesting question about why the opposite hemisphere of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. So our left hemisphere controls the right side of our body, the right hemisphere controls the left side of our body. Why did that happen? Good question. Now, some said, well, shouldn't it be that the left hemisphere controls the left side of the body, the right controls the right? That would make more sense. Yes, you are correct. That seem, that would make more sense. So it's so that crossover was probably something that occurred under some environmental evolutionary pressure back, back before there were humans. And in fact, there appears to be evidence of this. Well, we can see that all vertebrates have this have this opposite hemisphere control of the body. So it must have been something that happened in the evolutionary process somewhere between invertebrates and vertebrates. Why it happened, we don't know. It's difficult to go back and say, okay, what environmental pressure caused this to happen? And you've got to remember with evolution, it doesn't always have to necessarily confer a huge advantage. It could just be that slightly more of the species at the time survived and were able to breed over other, over a species that didn't have this change or this small change um, in their physiology. That evolution doesn't always have to make sense. It just has to be a small step in development at that particular time under those particular conditions gave a very, very small survival advantage. Or the other side of evolution is didn't give any survival disadvantage and so remained in the population as well. So evolution doesn't always have to necessarily make sense here and now. That it can be something very small that caused us to develop a certain way a long time ago. Let's see, was there anything else? Several of one person asked, why is the endocrine system slow versus the nervous system being fast? Well, the nervous system is relying on this network of neurons throughout our body, and it's transmitted kind of electrically and chemically. If you remember, within the neuron, it's kind of electrical, and then between neurons, there's the synapse there transmitting neurotransmitters across the synaptic gap to the next neurons it's connected to. So our nervous system is pretty instantaneous in its messaging. The endocrine system are glands around the body that are releasing hormones into our bloodstream, and then our bloodstream is carrying these hormone signals around to the rest of our body. And they are in turn telling our body to start to react in a certain way or start to develop in a certain way. So that process is a lot slower. It has to rely on the blood circulating around our body, and it's initiating things. It's not an immediate signal. It's just saying, start to do this. So that's why the endocrine system is a lot slower than our nervous system. Final mention is our reflexes. So with our reflexes, and we're talking about voluntary versus involuntary movement, one of the things is, one of the examples I used to use is voluntary movement is when you voluntarily move your body around. That's voluntary movement. A reflex or an involuntary movement is, imagine you put your hand down on a hot stove top. Your hand will immediately jerk off that hot stove top, and that's because we have spinal reflexes which act quicker than our voluntary process of sensing pain, making a decision, and sending commands to the muscles in the arm. That instead, our spine can shortcut that process. It receives a pain signal, and it can send a message directly back to the muscle saying, contract, and our hand will be jerked off the hot stove top. That way we can avoid the lengthier process of the signal from pain traveling up through the spine to our brain becoming aware of it, our brain saying, oh, our hand is on this hot stove top and it's hurting, I need to take it off now, and then sending the command to our muscles to take our hand off the hot stove top. If we had to do that, although that can still happen in a very, very short time, damage may have occurred by then. So it's good to have an even quicker way of reacting to remove ourselves from damage. So that's an example of an involuntary movement. As always, folks, I do read everything you post on the discussion boards. That's how I generated this list today. Sorry it went on for so long. It was kind of a personally interesting topic of mine. So yes, normally sometime during the next week is when I'll grade everybody's discussion posts. For the most part, if you have done them and written something more than, yes, I agree, then there's no reason why you shouldn't get full marks for that. Please make sure your diary is at 250 words or more for the remaining diary entries. And I will make another video post next week. Thanks very much, folks.